Great. All right, so today we'll finish the introduction to Proverbs, the first 9 chapters of Proverbs. And we've been looking at, I set up 8 lessons on Proverbs. So we looked at an introduction to the book, what Solomon wrote and how it's structured and things like that. We looked at Proverbs 1 through 7, because it's kind of like the preface or prologue to the book. It gives us a lot of information about understanding Proverbs, or what the purpose of the book of Proverbs is. Last week we talked about the first 4 chapters, and we'll review that here today. But the point I made there was the first 9 chapters prepare us for studying Proverbs. And what we find out is they're kind of like prerequisites. Some of our courses, like Chemistry 2, you have to complete Chemistry 1 before you can take Chemistry 2. Well, Proverbs 1 through 9 is kind of like that. You have to look at these things, see if they are characteristic of your life, and if they are, then you can proceed to the rest of the book. So we're going to look at Proverbs 5 through 9 today. And then I picked 3 topics to look at that are throughout the book of Proverbs, that Proverbs actually talks quite a bit about. And then what does Proverbs teach us about God? How does it add to our knowledge of Him? So we'll conclude with that. And as of right now, I'm not scheduled out yet for March, so we'll just keep plugging away, and then pretty soon we'll be close to Easter too, so see what's going on there. But that's where we're at. So by way of review, wisdom teaching, we gave this kind of it's not really a definition, but wisdom teaching assumes an all-pervading plan and order for the universe, because God created it, which man must follow and live according to in order to live with skill. And the short definition was wisdom is skill in godly living. And I mentioned the word godly last time, and I went ahead and put it in this time. Wisdom is skill in godly living. And we'll actually run into this, the defense of this idea is in Proverbs chapter 8. And that's where it actually comes from. And we'll look at Proverbs 8 today a little bit, and so we'll see that there. I'll point that out. So a review of the first 4 chapters. So these were questions that I came up with that kind of summarized the teaching in the early lessons. Chapters 1 through 9 there's 10 lessons that each start with the phrase "my son," and but I kind of summarized what they were after by way of preparation. How do we prepare ourselves for studying the book of Proverbs? So these are the 4 questions from last week. From chapter 1, who do we ask for advice? Where do we seek out advice? Who are our counselors? And if we think about that question and we meditate on that question, it prepares us for looking at Proverbs, because we can say, maybe I have some people I seek for advice that I shouldn't, or maybe I don't have good counselors in my life and I need to find some, and I'm going to go seek them out. So this is a good question to ask ourselves. Whose example do we follow? So this is skill in living. So someone's living out their life, and you say, I've been watching that person, and that person seems to be wise with their money. I want to follow their example. This person over here seems foolish with their money. I don't want to follow their example. I don't want to follow their example, but I can still learn from their ways. What way are we pursuing? We talked about the end of the matter. Are we looking at the consequences of our choices, of our actions? And then what do we do with our time, or how do we prioritize learning wisdom and devoting ourselves to wisdom instead of using our time in other ways. So that's a little review of chapter 4. And these 10 lessons are one person titles the 10 lessons, the value of wisdom, which is where that phrase comes from. All right, so today, we'll start in chapter 5 and kind of look at chapters 5 through 9. So if you have your Bible there, open to Proverbs 5. That would be helpful. And again, chapter 5 starts with my son. And there is, in chapter 5, well, actually here, I'll go, this is just kind of an outline. So chapter 5 is a warning against harlotry or prostitution. Chapter 6, verses 1 through 19, is almost an aside. Okay, it almost breaks the train of thought in chapters 5 through 9. So there's 3 follies and 7 abominations, or 3 admonitions and 7 abominations that we'll look at there. The rest of chapter 6 through chapter 7 talks about adultery, not prostitution. The text actually makes a distinction between those two. And then we have Lady Wisdom in chapter 8 and chapter 9, and then chapter 9 concludes, chapter 9 concludes a little bit with Lady Folly. So number 10 is sometimes Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly or Dame Folly or something like that. But there's a comparison between wisdom and folly. And I make the point in your notes, but I also will make it a little bit later as we get really to chapter 7. There's something going on with this discussion of prostitution and adultery and the conversation of wisdom and folly. One is representative of another, we'll put it that way, or something like that. So we'll talk about those there. All right, so the first one, chapter 5, I put this down for chapter 5, is the purity of mind. And the question here is, are you in control of your passions? Now, the word passions in the Bible, I have to start with this right away, is not ever good. Your passions always drive you to sins of the flesh. Now, the word passion in America today has taken on a positive connotation. What's your passion? Well, the answer to that question is kind of awkward, because I only have one passion in life, and that's my wife. But we don't use it that way anymore. We use it more broadly, and you're supposed to follow your passions and this kind of stuff. So I kind of flinch because I always think of passions in the way the Bible uses the word, and then I'm thinking, well, I don't want to follow my passions. They'll lead me astray. So, but the idea is just following your desires, just acting really nothing more than an animal. You know, if you have an animal, it doesn't matter what kind it is. Cat, dog, rabbit, mouse, I don't know, turtle. Okay. Your animals behave as they are created. They are just simply animals. You know, in our house, you can't leave bread on the counter or anything made with bread, because there's a cat who will hunt it down, kill it, and eat it. And you can't scold her for that, really, because she's just acting like an animal. She's just following the desire of her stomach. All she's doing. Well, we aren't purely animals. We're humans made in the image of God. And we're given the ability to not just live according to our passions or to our desires. We're given the ability to live according to principle. We can go up to a counter full of cupcakes and say, I am going to abstain. I am not going to eat a cupcake. I will give Paul my second cupcake, my cupcake. He can have two. But we can control that. We don't have to give into it. And in chapter 5, we have this contrast between the prostitute and the wife. We won't spend a lot of time here, but you'll see at the beginning of chapter 5, he says, "My son, be attentive to my wisdom, incline your ear to my understanding, that you may keep discretion and your lips may guard knowledge." Verse 3, "For the lips of a forbidden woman drip honey." So the ESV says forbidden woman. Now in the old King James, this was the strange woman. Okay, so most of us grew up with being afraid of strange women. Okay, and it doesn't just mean the foreigner in the sense of she's from another country. Okay, the connotation is clearly that she's living the life of a prostitute. And so he gives the son a choice. Remember, wisdom is always discerning, making choices. He gives the son the choice. Well, he doesn't really give him a choice. He says, don't do it. But he says to stay away from her, the prostitute, for every reason. There's no good end. You're only living according to your desires. You aren't controlling yourself. It comes to a bad end, verse 14. There's just nothing good that comes from that. And then contrast verse 15. Here he talks about get a wife. And then you're free. Your wife, is everything to you. And he says, drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. And this is an analogy, it's a word picture, to talk about wife and family. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of your youth. And so he's using this analogy to say your wife is everything. That's where your love should be. That's where your desire should be. That's where your choice should be. Don't let yourself just be drawn away by sensual desires. Now, one of the things, and because this comes up again, 5, 6, 7, and 9, this comes up. There is a difference. One of the differences he's setting up here is, in this chapter, is the right way to love someone versus just fulfilling a desire, a fleshly desire, where there's no love or anything involved there. So part of the choice, in fact, I had worded this question a little bit differently at one time, and then I rewrote it a couple times. But one of the contrasts he's making here is, are you loving your wife the right way? Are you loving God the right way? Doing that is not just merely an act of the flesh. That is something that distinguishes us, that separates us from the mere animals. But in the scriptures, we find that the idea of prostitution, adultery, sexual sins is extremely common. So when we go back through Genesis, for example, Genesis 1, man is blessed. Man and wife are blessed. Be fruitful and multiply. But shortly after, we see through the history of man, two main problems that come up, or three, I guess you could even say. But the second sin, after Adam and Eve, is Cain kills Abel. Okay, it's an act of violence. Later in chapter 4, there's another story about an act of violence. In fact, it's later in Genesis 4, just so I get the name right. Lamech, in Methusael fathers Lamech, and Lamech took 2 wives. And what's the penalty for having 2 wives? It's having 2 wives. Okay. That was, I had a teacher a long time ago that used to say that the penalty for polygamy was having more than 1 wife. But Lamech took 2 wives. Okay, so this is the first time where we see polygamy in the Bible. And one of those women had a son, but Lamech says, or one of his wives, Zillah, verse 23, Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. So some young guy lashes out at Lamech, and Lamech just kills him, murders him. And he boasts about it. If Cain's revenge is 7-fold, Cain and Abel, then Lamech's is 77, and he mocks. Okay, so we have violence and sexual perversion right away at the beginning of the fall of the human race. Chapter 6, I mean, we can get into the daughters of sons of God and the daughters of Adam issue there, but again we have sexual issues going on there. Then you just go through the Old Testament. Genesis 38 is where we run into, I think, our first prostitute in the story of Judah and Tamar. And so, which is all kinds of wrong in that story. David's 2 big sins: murdered Uriah and had committed adultery with Bathsheba. 2 of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not commit adultery, followed by thou shalt not murder. Okay, so these sins plague humankind. When you look around you today in the world and you say, well, there's even the gender, stuff going on, all affects what? Right? Sexual sins. That's what it's focused on. And so that's not a surprise. It's not a surprise that Satan's lies, we've seen throughout Scripture, Satan's lies target that blessing that God pronounced back in Genesis 1 on Adam and Eve. And man and Satan have distorted it ever since. So there is... So we're going to see this theme is prevalent in Proverbs, to keep yourself away from the strange woman, from the prostitute, keep yourself away from adultery, but perhaps it can't be overstated at any time in human history, this need for this. But it comes down to this. Are we in control of those fleshly desires, or do we simply give in to them? And we extrapolating that beyond just this example. So that's chapter 5. Then chapter 6 has verses 1 through 19 has these admonitions. And you'll notice that I kind of put this outline on here, and I did mention these in your notes, these 3. There are 3 warnings that the Father gives to the Son in chapter 6. And I've just kind of summarized them here. The first one is the danger of making promises. The second one is the danger of laziness. And the third is the danger of conniving. I don't know, there might be a better word than conniving. And then there's just the list of abominations towards the end of the section. But chapter 6, verse 1 says, if you have put up security for your neighbor, have given your pledge for a stranger, if you are snared in the words of your mouth, caught in the words of your mouth, then do this, my son, and save yourself. Now, the words security and pledge are often have a financial connotation to them. In other words, you ask somebody if you could borrow money. Hey, Paul, can I borrow couple dollars, I want to go buy a Coke or Pepsi or something, a bottle of pop. What he's saying here is actually, that's not wise. Okay, and then what he says at the end is, in verse 5, or verse 4, give your eyes no sleep and your eyelids no slumber. Save yourself like a gazelle from the hand of the hunter, like the bird of the hand of the fowler. Pay it back. I guess the rest of verse 3. For you have come into the hand of your neighbor. Go hasten and plead urgently with your neighbor. In other words, pay it back. Get out of the debt as soon as you possibly can. Now, he also says in verse 2, if you are snared in the words of your mouth. So there are laws in the Old Testament about making a vow. So not necessarily financially related, but it's making a promise. I promise I'm going to do this or that. And what he's warning against is don't make those. Because what happens if you can't pay it back? That's the problem. Now, if you can pay it back, you can pay the vow, you can fulfill the promise to your friend or to your neighbor. Well, okay, you can do that. It's not prohibiting you from doing that, but it's giving a warning. It's giving danger. Don't do that. Don't borrow that money in this case if you don't have money to pay it back. And if you have the money to pay it back, just pay cash for whatever it is you want, right? Because then you're not in someone else's debt. So that's kind of that first paragraph. It's a warning that there's a danger in doing that. It doesn't prohibit it, but there's a danger in it. Verse 6 starts a very well-known passage. Go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. Without having any chief officer or ruler, she prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in harvest. How long will you lie there, O sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep? And this very, very famous little saying here, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. Okay. And then all of a sudden, poverty comes because you don't have your work done. And the 7 deadly sins, one of the 7 deadly sins is sloth, which isn't ever... It's one of the interesting things about the 7 deadly sins is there are a couple that are never mentioned as sins in the Bible, and laziness is one of them. But it becomes, in the Christian tradition, one of the 7 deadly sins. So which came first, the idea of being lazy in sloth or the animal? Yeah, that's good. Anyway, that's a rabbit trail. All right. And then the third one, the danger of conniving, being a worthless person. And we probably are all old enough to know someone that this describes. A worthless person, a wicked man who goes about with crooked speech. And there was the idea of crookedness popped up in a previous chapter. Winks with his eyes, signals with his feet, points with his finger, with perverted heart devises evil, continually sowing discord. Therefore calamity will come upon him suddenly, and in a moment he will be broken beyond healing. So this is the person who's constantly conniving, who's telling you half-truths to get you to do something, and then he can go to somebody else and tell them a half-truth and get them to do something, and he's winking and jesting. It's one of those things. We run into fraudulent people at the university all the time. They try to get financial aid, and then they get a check from financial aid, and you never hear from them again. We had we laugh because we're like, as much time as you put in trying to defraud us or the federal government, you could have just gotten a job. Right? And we had one, and sometimes you don't know if they're telling the truth, so we try to do some investigation, but we had one, and thought that somebody had stolen her identity and was using it to defraud the government. And so we asked, Did you file a police report? That's the first thing you should do if you believe someone has stolen your identity. Well, I was told that I was supposed to contact the Federal Trade Commission, and that's what I'm going to do. You're going to contact the Federal Trade Commission. Okay, go ahead. They have nothing to do with this. Like, you obviously don't know what you're talking about, and you're not strengthening your case. So we just said, yeah, go ahead, do that. And yeah, so why don't you just work for a living? And then the admonitions, or the abominations, there are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to him. And then there's this list. Now, often when we see a 6, yea, 7, or sometimes there's a 3, yea, 4 type of thing, usually people will say, well, the 7th is the worst. That's the one that they're really trying to point us to. But all of them are still obviously terrible things. Haughty eyes, so that's a person who's got a proud look upon their face. They're arrogant. We would say they have their nose up in the air. That would probably be the expression we would use. A lying tongue, someone who can't tell the truth. Hands that shed innocent blood, murder. A heart that devises wicked plans. Okay, so people who sit there and think of evil things to do. Feet that make haste to run to evil. A false witness who breathes out lies. And one who sows discord among the brothers, which he mentioned, the worthless person up above does that also. And the liar versus the false witness. So actually, in the 10 Commandments, when it says, thou shalt not bear false witness, that is actually a courtroom setting. It's you going to testify about your neighbor, and it'd be like me saying, oh yeah, I saw John do X, Y, and Z when I never saw him. Okay, so I'm bearing false witness. Versus lying, which is anytime you're not telling the truth. You know, inside, outside court, doesn't matter what it pertains to. So there's a little different nuance there with the witness. And sowing discord. But these are things that the Lord hates. And I think it's important to notice that God hates certain things. It is okay to hate certain things. Certain actions that people do. It is okay. Now, today you see things like, we're going to get rid of hate. We want to, this is going to be a hate-free zone or something. And so you see this on posters, or you'll see this on TV or something. And the first thing that comes to my mind is that I want to ask someone. I haven't had the opportunity yet. So do you hate hate? Do you hate hatred of all kinds? Well, they can't say yes because they have a hatred that they allow. So they immediately get stuck into a thing. But for Christians, we have to remember that there are actual things that we should hate. There are actual things that God hates, and we need to hate those things and and consider them, as not worthy of our time. The question I put up here, though, is how do we accept admonitions? And this is, I think, for young people and old people, I guess you talk to young people and you try to help them sometimes, and you give a young person an admonition in a loving, concerned, kind way, and sometimes their attitude is, I know. You don't have to bother me with that. I don't care. They'll have kind of an attitude about it. But sometimes you can go to an older person and try to admonish them, and it can sometimes come back even like, well, I'm an old dog. I don't learn new tricks. I'm just that way. Always have been. Ask my wife. She's been trying to change me for 40 years, hasn't worked yet. Okay, so one of the things we have to be careful of is that we're actually open. We need to be free to accept admonition. We need to have the right attitude about that, so that we can learn wisdom. All right, so that's admonition. And then, just take some other notes here. Okay, yeah. So starting in chapter 6, verse 20, and going through the end of chapter 9, the end of chapter 6 and the beginning of chapter 7, we have two more lessons, this time against adultery. And in chapter 6, verse 24, again, the son, listen to my words, because they will preserve you from the evil woman, from the smooth tongue of the adulteress. Now, here, it actually mentions the neighbor's wife, and who the ESV calls the evil woman. It's the neighbor's wife who is trying to seduce you. And then where it says the adulteress, that's actually the strange woman. I'm not quite sure why the ESV translated these words the way they did. Kind of confusing to me. But anyway, so you have the adulterer and you have the prostitute. Verse 25, do not desire her beauty in your heart. Do not let her capture you with her eyelashes. For the price of a prostitute is a loaf of bread, but a married woman hunts down a precious life. So he's actually comparing the difference between the prostitute and the adulterous woman. Obviously, the adulterous woman is married to another man. So he talks about the dangers of this, and even getting down to verse 34, he says, you'll also make the husband jealous. He says, for jealousy makes a man furious, and he will not spare when he takes revenge. He will accept no compensation. He will refuse, though you multiply gifts. So this is the neighbor who's trying to seduce you. This is her husband. This is how he's going to respond when he finds out. So this is specifically against adultery. And then chapter 7 starts a new lesson, my son, keep my words. And then in verse 5, to keep you from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress. So the forbidden woman is the strange woman, and the adulteress is again the married, in the context, is the married woman. And then he goes into the long story where he mentions this, and I just want to read the first couple of verses of chapter 7. At the window of my house I looked out through my lattice, and I've seen among the